Now then, how's it going and welcome to the channel. The following is taken from my podcast The Film Fella and Friends and is part of the Real Natter series. In this one I'm joined by the host of the podcast That Song From That Movie, Dietrich Jeffries, and entertainment journalist and Spidey fanatic Eammon Jacobs, as we talk all things Spider-Man and more specifically Miles Morales. This is a four-parter to cover the four areas we ended up discussing. Part 1 goes over Miles' comic book origins and introduction, Part 2 covers the 2018 film Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, Part 3 the subsequent soundtrack to said movie, and finally Part 4 covering the much acclaimed new Insomniac Games Miles Morales game on the PlayStation 4 and 5. For the full entire podcast, head over to your favourite podcast player and search for The Film Fella and Friends. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and chuck us a cheeky like for more content like this very soon. Anyway, enough from me, on with the show!
The Film Fella.
Comic book origins.
Yes, very similar to Peter Parker. I mean, you know, I think the way that they were very smart in terms of keeping it simple but radically changing everything. You know, in terms of the Ultimate Comics, Peter got his powers from Oscorp, from the genetically altered spider, as we all know.
Yep.
And the way that it happens with Miles is very different. He's not on a field trip. He's not, you know, in some random lab somewhere. He goes to see his uncle because he's worried about his family life. He's going to a new school. And right from the offset, the key thing about Miles is his family. It's his personal life. It's, you know, it's his shift from being a kid to a teenager, very much like Peter was. And this spider crawls out of his uncle's bag because his uncle is the Prowler. You know, mild-mannered bloke in the daytime and a corporate espionage robber in the evening.
Like everyone.
Like everyone, just standards. And yeah, he broke into the old Oscorp offices and this spider happened to get into his bag and bites Miles. It's very different to Peter, who his interests immediately are very clear. Like, he's a scientist, he's interested in all this, whereas the origin is very close, very tight-knit to Miles' family, and it's a key thing for him going forward. Like, that conflict between his uncle, his father, and then him caught in the middle is fascinating. It's great to see the way that Bendis picks that apart in his typical dialogue, drawn-out sort of style.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that Bendis has some great story elements, but his dialogue is interesting. Is the way I'm gonna phrase that.
Yeah, I think, like I say, I have read the Ultimate Spider-Man run, obviously, a while ago now, and yeah. I have, obviously, I know who, it's Brian Michael Bendis, right?
Brian Michael Bendis,
I was going to say Michael Brian Bendis, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. See, look, already outing myself, but yeah, I'm obviously aware of sort of like the talk within comic book readers that, you know, there is aspects that people absolutely like adore, especially like from like I guess like earlier runs of what he's done, but then like dialogue wise, it's just
his early Spidey, his early Peter Parker stuff is great. I think it's fantastic, and personally some of my favorite stuff, Spidey related, not just in comics as general. But it's kind of, Miles spins out of the death of Peter Parker because obviously legacy characters, you have to kill the previous one off.
Obviously.
Stereotypically. Yeah. And death of Peter Parker.
I like this.
I cried my bloody eyes out. I'm not going to lie to you.
It's epic, isn't it? Like, I do remember pretty
epic.
Much the whole, like I say, read it a long time ago, but I do remember that whole comic book arc. I don't think, because it's going off on a little tangent, you know, I've already warned you this happens on
the
here.
First of many.
Yep. The in the Ultimates universe, for anyone that's not quite sure what we're getting at, it's sort of like an adjacent comic book universe to the 616, isn't it? The main Marvel universe, the continuity that's kind of carried on in one way, shape or form since the original comics back in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. The Ultimates are like the Avengers, in the Ultimate Universe, it's still like
Yeah.
Thor, Captain America, Iron Man. They're a bit edgier. The best way I can describe it is like the characters are just a bit edgier. The stories are a bit more adult. Like,
I mean, there are some pretty messed up stuff, especially from Mark Miller. Ultimates wise, there is a run of Avengers which sees Red Skull's origin in the most messed up fashion ever.
I can only imagine.
That I read far too early as a child. So, but yeah, it is a bit more edgy. I think that's the best way to describe it. But essentially, Peter dies whilst battling the Sinister Six and Norman Osborn all at the same time. And he dies in Aunt May's arms, and it's very sad. And oh boy, I cried manly tears. But like, it isn't quite clear just at the time frame, but it's kind of implied that it's like maybe a month or so before that is when Miles gets bitten. So he's kind of developing these powers, and immediately they're very different from Peter's. The first power that he exhibits, he goes invisible. And then he has his sort of venom strike. So there's already differences, like rather than your typical war quarreling, web slinging, Peter Parker. And they were very clear from the outset that this isn't just Peter Parker's replacement. Like, this is Spider-Man. He's got all, the same problems in his personal life, but for a new generation of readers, without making it feel forced. And there was a lot of criticism because, the stereotypical comic reader. Yeah, the stereotypical comic reader was like, "Oh, Black Spider-Man, no, that's not." Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's a topic for another day. Miles Morales is great. Shut up.
Yeah.
That's enough I'll say about that. But and it's just, so he basically runs into the accident or the big fight where Peter gets killed and sees Peter die, and it's kind of, he has this weird sort of passing of the mantle via Gwen Stacy, who gives him the great power, great responsibility speech in a very ultimate Gwen Stacy way, where she's like, basically, don't be a dick. Wear a costume, protect the ones you love, don't be a dick. And
standard stuff, really.
Standard stuff. And when he first starts crime fighting, he essentially wears a Halloween costume, very much like he does in Spiderverse.
Yeah.
And the first reaction of everybody is like, that's poor taste. What are you doing? This kid's just died. Like, like, he doesn't even put on his costume until the end of this lovely little collection.
I like this. I like the little dip into the little bag at the side.
I mean, it's got to be done. Basically, if you are interested in Miles Morales, I would just recommend getting the trade. The first volume is it's perfect. It's great. It includes the bit with the death of Spider-Man, as well as his little fight with a villain called Kangaroo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that iconic villain, who is an Australian man in a leather jacket. It's
all the stereotypes.
All the stereotypes, of course. I'm pretty sure he does have a cork hat as well. I might be wrong on that. But yeah, it's just, he doesn't get his typical black and red suit until the end of that book. And I don't know, it's just quite interesting the way they drew it out. It wasn't straight away, hey, look, it's the new Spider-Man, there you go. It took quite a while, took quite a few issues for him to get going, which I really admire, because it would have been so easy for them to just go, oh yeah, you got bitten, here's the costume, see you later.
Just walk away.
They do hold him accountable for, essentially dishonoring Pete's memory for putting on the red and blue. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of liked that. He's a 13-year-old kid as well at this time. Yeah. He's a little bit younger than Peter was when he first got his powers. So that's a lot of responsibility.
Buzzword.
Buzzword, responsibility. To put on this very young kid who's thrown into the world of the Ultimates, because Nick Fury's like, what are you doing? Like, no, this is not okay. You're gonna die. So I just think it's very well done. I think the later stuff where they combine universes, because as you were saying, like, the Ultimate Universe is completely separate from the 616. Yep. When they start trying to cross those over and bringing him into the mainstream universe, it does get very messy. And as Marvel does every so often with universe-altering events.
I think even that, like you've just said, any comic book franchise that goes, you know what, let's just press the reset button and hope that everyone doesn't lose the shit. it never works. Like DC have had the Rebirth stuff and everything, and that always has a bit of contention with people.
Yeah, I mean the DC Rebirth stuff, like obviously tangent again.
I told you.
Yeah, the initial run of Rebirth is great for every single character. It's very solid, and it's a really good starting point for new readers. For example, like Aquaman, for me, couldn't give a shit beforehand. Aquaman Rebirth, incredible. Does like the politics side of things. It's kind of that, but for every character.
Yeah.
And then when they started to get messier and messier, and we're like, oh, Watchmen are in it. It got messy. I mean, I think there's a big problem in comics in general is, publishers get ahead of themselves. And obviously there was a marketing aspect for Spider-Man, because it's like, oh, we've got this Spider-Man in this universe and this Spider-Man in this universe. Like, let's bring them together.
Yeah.
And at first it was fun, and then they did it again and it got really complicated. And yeah, so Spider-Man is a kind of a fun story, and they leave it on a cliffhanger of, well, who is Miles Morales in the mainstream universe?
Yeah.
And Peter's reaction is like, oh shit, and you don't know who it is. It's kind of like, a lot of people were like, oh, maybe he's the president, maybe he's, a police chief, maybe he's a villain. And it just goes in some very questionable directions, personally.
I'm really intrigued now, because obviously I knew that they brought them together.
Yeah.
And I knew that they'd done that, because, again, slight mini tangent, I'm not going too far with it, but like, didn't they basically bring in Old Man Logan into the 616, and like they've basically took all the best aspects of whatever comic book series that Marvel had got going on that was selling okay, and obviously Logan the film was a spin-off sort of idea from that, and all these other areas that they thought, oh, that works, they just smashed them all together. So I was aware of that. What I wasn't aware of is that once they'd done that, are you now suggesting that within the 616 there was also a Miles Morales of sorts, or someone with those powers, but you didn't know it was?
So basically how it is like Spider-Man, they have this kind of fight. I'm pretty sure it's like Electro or Vulture, could have been Mysterio. Anyway, it's kind of a really self-contained story, and it's quite fun. And they leave it on the cliffhanger of who is Miles Morales. And the second one opens it up, and he's basically just a crime lord, essentially.
Right.
The low kingpin.
Right.
But it doesn't look anything like Miles Morales in the Ultimate Universe. He doesn't have spider powers. He's covered in scars, because obviously an evil villain has to have facial deformities.
Obviously. Of course.
Can't trust him. You can't trust him.
Again, another topic for another time.
Yeah.
And he's just a bit of a dick.
Well, as most villains are, I guess.
As most villains are. It was a fun idea. If they'd have just left it ambiguous, I think it would have been so much better. But obviously this is comics, and we have to have an answer for everything. And everything has to be connected. So Spider-Man 2 is not that great, personally.
Right. Okay, I will bear that in mind. There's a lot of stuff there. I don't know about you, Dietrich, but there's a lot of stuff there that I just didn't know about, which is quite useful.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I've not really read the comics, so my exposure to most of this stuff is either Fox Kids cartoon shows from the 90s.
That's all of us. That's literally all of us on this.
So,
classic.
Yeah.
That theme tune.
Yes.
Iconic. Honestly,
iconic.
I can hear the riff in my head already. It's brilliant.
Between that
I got Disney Plus,
yeah, well, that was the first thing that I chained after watching like all the MCU films, was just like, ooh, I can pretend to be like 12 again and just watch all these. So yeah, I just vegged out on the sofa like I did at 12 in my pajamas. And just
same actually. Yeah.
But I, to be honest, that's probably could be another talking topic for another time. Could just delve into the animated Foxyverse, Fox Kidsyverse. I don't really know what we can call it, but
you're never going to make that work.
No, I'm trying so desperately. Foxyverse. It sounds like some sort of like I forgot what furry. It sounds like some sort of like furry thing that I'm trying to. Like,
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Probably should stop.
It's not buzzword friendly, that one.
No, not really. It's not really the one, is it? Is there anything else that you want to discuss about comic books regarding Miles Morales origins? Anything?
I would say if you are relatively new to comics, for example, that Miles Morales is a great place to start. He's a very modern character, doesn't have the constraints of a lot of the continuity aspects that come with so many of these decades-old characters that you don't need to know every single person involved.
Yeah, that's always the problem I have with trying to get into comics is I feel like it's such a huge amount of stuff to actually get your head around that where do you jump in?
It's very dense. It's very dense. And later on, or sort of the more recent runs of Miles are dense because he's had what's coming up to nearly 10 years of Miles Morales next year. Like he only debuted in 2011.
Makes me feel old, that. I don't know why. It shouldn't, but it does.
So yeah, I'd say that first initial run would be perfect. A perfect place to start.
Hey up, you're still here. Thanks for checking us out. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this coming very soon. I've no idea which part you're currently watching, but head here to watch the other parts from this episode. For the full podcast, simply search for The Film Fella and Friends on your podcast provider. That's it from me. See you in a bit.